Today on Stronger Than Reason, we dig into the various New Order side projects like Electronic, Revenge, and the other two. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So far, we've covered the history of New Order from its inception in 1980 through their fifth album, 1989's Technique, minus their fourth album, 1986's Brotherhood. Now, why haven't I tackled Brotherhood yet? I like to mix it up a bit. I get bored easily. In this case, my ADHD tendencies are edging out my OCD tendencies, and we'll all learn to deal with it. But needless to say, we'll get to Brotherhood eventually. In the meantime, I want to talk about an interesting period in the band's history from the release of their World Cup anthem, World in Motion, on May 21st, 1990, all the way through to their release of the first single off, Republic, which occurred on April 5th, 1993. So that's not quite 3 full years, the longest hiatus that they had taken to that point. And it happens to be the time when I became a fan. So the fact that they weren't coming out with any New Order material during that time was a bit frustrating for me. I didn't understand what was going on. Well, it turns out what was going on was an old story, one that has played out in thousands of bands once they reached a certain threshold of notability, and it had to do with a peculiar disease called lead singer's syndrome. See, what happens is that a band gets a bit of success, and the lead singer, being the individual thrust into the spotlight, begins to attribute that success to his or her own personal qualities, and begins to look upon the rest of the band as lackeys, vassals, or indeed as mere hired goons. So the first symptom is often when the lead singer decides to become the sole songwriter and makes a move to get a bigger slice of the songwriting credits and hence publishing. It's common for the singer to say something along the lines of, "I can only sing my own words, otherwise I can't sing with conviction," while dreaming of royalty checks and publishing deals. Now, this may recur over time to the point where the singer edges the rest of the band out of songwriting entirely. At this point, the singer starts to wonder why he or she continues to put up with any minor annoyance, like having to make artistic compromises, or having to go on tour, or having to listen to anyone else's opinion, or having to be considerate and thoughtful. So the singer will inevitably come to the conclusion that he or she is better off not dealing with anyone else at all, and that the rest of the band is so much dead weight, an albatross around their neck. In the singer's mind, they're the ones holding the key to the castle, so the logical thing to do is lock everyone else out. Rarely does the singer have the guts to just squash the band there and then. Instead, they float a trial balloon. They call a band meeting and announce that they'd like to do a solo project. The band's first reaction, naturally, is utter shock. No one saw this coming, unbelievably. Next is anger. They view it as base treachery. After all, haven't we worked so hard and so long in an egalitarian way to finally achieve this success? Who does this jerk think they are? Finally, once they accept it's happening, each member decides to do their own solo project as well, and thus the band fractures for a time into various factions, none of which ever seem to do as well as the original, but which exist only to satisfy the various members' artistic drives or egos, depending on how charitable you want to be. As for the fans, they're left with more junk to buy, of course, and in every project, they can see bits of why they like the original band. The side projects, in fact, can give insight into each individual's contributions, cast into stark relief what each band member brought to the table, so side projects can be scientifically interesting, even if they're less worthy overall. Now, that is the general pattern of lead singer syndrome. It can play out more or less like that. In New Order, it was precisely like this. The Smiths and Talking Heads had much the same experience, and so did countless other bands. I'm sure you can think of many, and if not, just search for lead singers who went solo. So their New Order were in 1989, having come off, by all accounts, some massive success. Their compilation album, Substance 1987, which we talked about way back in episode 3, was rapidly becoming a bestseller. Technique, which we covered in episode 27, had managed to capture the summery zeitgeist of acid house and club culture while mixing in wistful acoustic guitar licks. It was rapidly becoming a fan favorite studio album, and if that weren't enough, they were tapped for the UK's World Cup anthem and delivered World in Motion, which became their first #1 single in the UK. So to the fans who didn't have the whole story, things seemed to be great indeed. However, you might know that New Order's then label, the legendary Factory Records, was not doing well financially. This story's been told many times. If you like watching videos, check out the BBC's excellent Factory Records documentary. If you prefer books, the go-to source is Factory, the Story of the Record Label by Mick Middles. Both are outstanding. But here is the TLDR. Throughout its history, Factory largely subsisted on the fortune earned by Joy Division and New Order. The success of those bands fueled Factory's various excesses. Now you might ask, how is that possible? Why didn't that money go to the band? And the answer is that it was more or less due to one person, New Order's then manager, Robert Leo Gretton, a guy beloved by all, I should point out. However, Rob had quite the conflict of interest going. He managed Joy Division and New Order, and for the most part, kept the band in the dark about their finances, generally doling out fixed salaries, and he also became a partner in Factory and ended up blurring the financial line between the two. Thus, Factory turned an empty yacht showroom into their own New York-style super club, the Hacienda, which sat empty and unloved for most of the 1980s. And they continued to make one terrible business investment after another. Even while the Hacienda foundered financially, they decided to open a bar, Dry 201, which suffered much the same fate. And by 1990, they were purchasing posh new digs for the label headquarters. Not to mention funding absurdly expensive trips for New Order and the Happy Mondays to record albums in Ibiza and Barbados, respectively. To say that Factory was run by people who lacked business sense would be a massive understatement. It's a bit like saying Nazi Germany was run by people who lacked religious and cultural sensitivity. Every Factory project hemorrhaged cash. The only ones who made out were the designers, like the cover artist Peter Saville, who was given the freedom and budget to design every record sleeve exactly the way he envisioned it. And like Ben Kelly, who was given the freedom and budget to go completely bananas with the architecture and interior design. And I guess all the employees that were just robbing both places blind, they did pretty well too. But year after year, Factory doubled down on terrible business decisions, threw good money after bad, and even the recent successes of New Order and Happy Mondays weren't enough to compensate. That ship was going down. Meanwhile, things weren't so great in the band either. They were simply sick of each other. The main beef was between lead singer and guitarist Barney Sumner and bassist Peter Hook. Judging from their memoirs, Hookie thought Barney was a miserable bastard who was moody and irritable at the best of times, and who was rapidly becoming a control freak. Decisions that were once made by the whole band were now his sole province, like lyrics, song titles, and even mixing. Hookie accuses Barney of discouraging any live bass and constantly clawing to bring the bass fader down. Then there was the subject of touring. Hookie claims Barney rarely agreed to play live, and when he did, he raged and made it an awful experience for all. In Hookie's mind, playing live was the lifeblood of an active band, but Barney was a creature of the studio, and there he began to exert undue control per his lead singer syndrome. Now the other two, keyboardist-guitarist Jillian Gilbert and her partner, drummer Stephen Morris, largely kept their heads down and offered little in the way of their own opinions on these matters. They more or less did as they were told by whoever was yelling the loudest. Now Rob, at this point, was a shadow of his former self. Having suffered a coke-fueled nervous breakdown in the late 80s, he was no longer willing or able to keep the various personalities in check, and was, at this point, largely focused not on the band, but on the hacienda and its various troubles, which weren't just financial. The rise of ecstasy and rave culture had brought illicit drugs to the fore, and with that came gangs and criminal violence. It seemed that the hacienda's days were numbered one way or another, and Rob struggled with that reality. So as you can see, this was a point unlike any other in New Order's history. It was in this climate that Barney announced his desire to make a solo record, and at the time, no one knew what that meant. Did it mean New Order were disbanding? Was Barney just trying to take his ball and go home? So New Order was on ice, and Barney's focus shifted to his new efforts. However, he quickly realized he wasn't having fun sitting in a studio by himself, so he phoned a friend, in this case Johnny Marr, former guitarist of Manchester's other favorite band, The Smiths, and together they became Electronic, a band name that, let's face it, only made sense in the halcyon days before search engine optimization, if it even made sense then. I mean, can you think of a band name that would be harder to search for? How about music, or cardboard, or website, or maybe you just get really clever and call your band Clickbait. There's a terrible name. So Lord help you if you went into National Record Mart and asked them if they had the new Electronic album. They'd almost certainly try to sell you something by Kraftwerk or Jean-Michel Jarre. So Barney and Johnny were now Electronic, which would forever be followed by some qualifier like band in parentheses, as you see here on Wikipedia. And they commenced work on some songs, the first of which came out as the Getting Away With It single at the arse end of 1989. Now, I didn't buy this single. I didn't know what a 12-inch single was in 1989, but in retrospect, I do like the cool cover here that mimicked a sophisticated liquor ad. It was designed by Peter Saville, of course, and came out on Factory. I wouldn't hear the song itself until I picked up the album, which naturally I did right when it was released, since it was somehow available in my neck of the woods, i.e. the middle of nowhere, USA. So I had heard this album was coming out not from the internet, which I wasn't yet on, but through a trade magazine. I remember visiting a friend of a friend who had some sort of hip music mag laying around, like Wow Sound Explosion or some such crap, and rather than try to have a conversation with this guy, I picked it up and leafed through it, only to find an article about this important upcoming supergroup, Electronic, which would feature members of New Order, The Smiths, and the Pet Shop Boys. Really? The Pet Shop Boys? I mean, now in high school, I hadn't heard any Smiths at all. They were just a complete mystery to me. And the only Pet Shop Boys I'd heard was the track everyone had heard, West End Girls, which was their first big hit, which I didn't dislike, but I didn't associate the Pet Shop Boys with anything indie. West End Girls was a massive hit, global, worldwide hit that was played to death even on our local FM radio. So I didn't really know what to make of their inclusion here, other than maybe the project really would be electronic, since the Pet Shop Boys seemed to be entirely synth-pop. Anywho, I went to the mall and ended up finding the album, much to my surprise, and picked it up on cassette, naturally, and much later I bought it on CD, and here it is. It's self-titled, and it features art not by Peter Saville, but by yet another veteran Factory graphic designer, Trevor Johnson, and that's evidently Barney and Johnny here. I was quite happy with this purchase. I took it home, I popped it in the old tape deck, and what did I hear? Well, I gotta admit, I was pretty happy with it. In short, it sounded like New Order minus Hookie's bass, or close enough to New Order that it filled my immediate need as a new fan for more of their stuff. In general, the songs were true to the band's name, more electronic than rock. I remember having the distinct impression that no real drums had been injured in the making of this record, and strangely very few guitars either. I say that's strange because when you think about it, Barney and Johnny were two of the most iconic guitarists of the post-punk era. I mean, Johnny wrote the music to How Soon Is Now. What more credentials do you need? And even if you didn't care for Barney's sporadic guitar work in New Order, you had to give it up to him for all the great riffs he came up with in Joy Division. I mean, nearly every song has memorable guitar licks. This album does start with an upbeat tune called Idiot Country that has some funky guitar, but after that, it's only there intermittently. Not that the songs are bad without guitar, but they're so synth-heavy that they sometimes feel a bit saccharine. I always thought this album could benefit from a big riff or two. But I'm nitpicking a little. I always like this album. It's packed full of musical ideas. There are a lot of melodies, a lot of rhythms, a lot of hooks, despite the ironic lack of Peter Hook. I liked it enough, I suppose, to repurchase it on CD and listen to it thousands of times. Now, I'm not going to talk about every track here because I don't think that's a good use of our time. Boy, that's about nearly unreadable. Let's open this up. But I do want to call out a couple of my favorites. The first track is Idiot Country. It's a pretty strong opener that cycles through a variety of moods, and it does the job of any opening track that's any good. It gives the listener a summary of what's to follow. And there's a remix of this song out there called Idiot Country 2 that used to be pretty hard to find. I don't know if that's still the case. It's also a very good remix. I also always like track 2, Reality, because it is the strongest bass line of any track here. It's pretty groovin'. Tighten Up is an okay tune, but it lost some appeal for me when I heard it in a David Copperfield magic show. Not a huge fan of David Copperfield. I'm more of a Penn and Teller guy. The Patience of a Saint is okay, being the more preferable of the two duets here between Barney and Neil Tennant of the Pet Shop Boys. Also, this song has some actual guitar. And then we have the less preferable duet, the aforementioned Getting Away With It, which should be taken in small doses lest it give you diabetes. This song, sure, okay, there are a lot of great ingredients in it. Neil's harmonies, Johnny's eloquent acoustic guitar solo, the tasteful string arrangement by Ann Dudley of The Art of Noise, no less. I do admire the production, but it's just way too twee for my tastes. It's just over the top. It sounds like a track pulled from an old Tom Jones record. It's adult contemporary, and 17-year-old me was not into adult contemporary. Hell, 50-something me is not into adult contemporary. So I give this track 2 thumbs down in a circle. Not a fan. So I'll skip a couple tracks here and talk about my favorite, a little tune called Get the Message. By the way, in true New Order fashion, most of these titles have absolutely nothing to do with the song or the lyrics, except the two with Neil Tennant. Go figure. Anyway, Get the Message is a gem. It's memorable. It's hooky. Again, though, without hooky. Has excellent guitar throughout. It's cool and groovy. And it has the second best drum fill sample ever. They even did a video for it that MTV actually played a few times. The video is really colorful, kind of clever, and fits the song well. In fact, I recently went through a bit of a Johnny Marr phase because he was on tour, and I saw him perform this song live with his band, and they did a really good job. The song holds up after all these years. So if you've never heard electronic, at least check out Get the Message. I think it's far better than Getting Away With It, even if it got much less hype. By the way, this is yet another song like True Faith and Round, where Barney just gripes about women spending his money. So this song's in good company. I don't know, maybe he should have written songs about the joys of donating to charity or something, because this complaining gets kind of old. So yeah, you got a couple more songs, yada yada. And finally, the big closer, Feel Every Beat. The notable thing here is that this tune more or less has Barney rapping. So yeah, that's something that's on here. Not a bad song, though. The chorus is great. The music is pretty good. But yeah, it's got Barney rapping on it. I do remember the folks on the old ceremony mailing list trying to puzzle out why he did that. The reaction, I gotta say, was not unlike the reaction to Geddy Lee's rap on Roll the Bones, which, by the way, also came out in 1991. Coincidence? I think not. And that's the album. So it's pretty good in retrospect. Not exactly New Order. Kind of sounds like some lightly refried New Order. But at this point, I was missing Hookie's bass. And speaking of, Hookie reacted to electronic much like Jerry Harrison reacted to David Byrne's announcement that he was going to go solo. He decided to make a solo album too. So much like Barney, he buggered off to his studio, which he cleverly called Sweet 16, that's S-U-I-T-E, and he diddled around with an Oberheim for a few hours before getting frustrated and realizing, much like Barney, that it sucks to be in the studio all alone. He was lonesome. So he called up some friends, and before long, he had his own band, which he named Revenge. Now, you might say it was his revenge against Barney, but really that was just a bonus. He copped the name from a George Michael video. George was wearing a leather jacket in the Faith video, and it said Revenge on the back. Now, I heard about Revenge around the same time I heard about electronic, though I still wasn't on the internet. I do recall that my friend Mike told me about it, and he must have gotten it from MTV or Spin magazine or something. He was generally more in the know about pop culture than I was, but soon enough, I was once again at the old National Record Mart, scouring the cassettes that began with R, and lo, there it was, 2 in a row. The new long player from Peter Hook's Revenge, One True Passion. Right away, I sensed a change in style. Call me crazy. Now, I was a pretty new fan at this point, as I mentioned, and I didn't have a great sense for who Hookie was as a person or his personality, and if I had, I might have got into this album expecting some serious ass-kicking rock, because Hookie, for those who don't know, was the only member of New Order who had any rock and roll swagger. With his long hair, his low-slung bass, his motorcycles, and his just general party guy lifestyle. However, I didn't know that about him. All I knew was that this was another New Order side project, so I bought the cassette, I took it home, and I popped it in. And what did I hear? Essentially, New Order. Yeah, it sounded like more New Order to me. The singer didn't sound exactly like Barney, but he was in the same general ballpark, except the thing I couldn't understand was that Hookie's bass wasn't very prominent. In fact, I couldn't hear much of it at all. Turns out Hookie would make a few tactical errors with Revenge, one of which was choosing not to play his signature high-pitched melodic phase-shifted bass licks. Lord knows why. In fact, it's ridiculous how both Barney and Hookie had forsaken their guitars, their chief musical weapons, in favor of sequencers and synthesizers. They both pretty much abandoned their trademark musical identities. Another whoopsie was Hookie bringing in Dave Hicks as a guitarist. In his memoir, Hookie fesses up that it was all a big misunderstanding. He had intended to bring in crack session guitarist Ash Taylor, but got mixed up as to who had played which guitar parts in the studio. Hicks, it turns out, was primarily a singer and just a mediocre guitarist. Cue several years of bad vibes as Hicks tried to become Revenge's lead singer over and over again. However, Hookie took that role for himself. These and a few other troubles formed a storm cloud that followed Revenge along. Unlike electronic, they would have no high-profile celebrity cameos. However, one thing Revenge did that electronic did not was tour. After all, Hookie's main beef with Barney was over the latter's reluctance to play live. So Revenge played out live quite a bit, and per Hookie, they had a ball. As far as I know, electronic only ever played one live show, opening for Depeche Mode at Dodger Stadium. Word in the street, and by the street I mean on ceremony, was that the synths weren't even plugged in. The music, at least, was all playback. So Hookie had that going for him, at least, and I'm not going to review One True Passion track by track, since honestly, the tunes are all kind of forgettable. I love Hookie, especially his most excellent and readable memoirs, but I did not enjoy this album as much as the electronic album. Sorry, Hookie. It just didn't have as many musical ideas, seemed a lot more unfocused to me. It's not terrible, and I did listen to it quite a bit back in the day, but it's just not something that I find myself going back to very much. Now, that said, I did buy this reissue on CD a few years back. One True Passion version 2.0. This is a 2-disc set with 32 tracks in all, probably way more Revenge than anyone ever asked for or wanted. This is more or less a complete discography of original tunes minus the zillions of remixes. In fact, this even includes their second release, the Gun World Porn EP. Yes, that's what it was called. I did used to have the original release of that on CD. Evidently, I sold it. Anywho, they also came out with a live CD called No Pain, No Gain. I have not listened to that at all, and honestly, I probably never will. But I think it ate Hooky up that his solo project did not fare as well as Barney's did commercially. Electronic would go on to have 2 more full-length albums, 1996's Raise the Pressure and 1999's Twisted Tenderness. Raise the Pressure didn't make much of an impression on me, though Twisted Tenderness definitely amped up the rock energy. Unfortunately, it was a casualty in the loudness war. The dynamic range in this album is just crap. I think it sounds super distorted. I like the songs, I just can't listen to it because the mastering is just awful. Electronic also had one other big single, Disappointed. It was big in the sense that it appeared on the soundtrack to the movie Cool World. You remember that one? That's going way back. Cool World was kind of the indie answer to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Anyway, Disappointed was a big Euro pop sort of song that once again featured Neil Tennant on vocals. I'll admit, a pretty good tune. Anyway, Hooky would have his real revenge later in the 90s. He would try to reconvene Revenge after New Order's 6th studio album, 1993's Republic, which I'll have to discuss someday. I suppose, maybe next April Fool's. But alas, Revenge was good and done by that time. The only former member who was still interested in collaborating was David Potts. So he and Hooky would form the band Monaco in 1995. Their first album, 1997's Music for Pleasure, would indeed spawn a hit, What Do You Want From Me? It would hit 11 in the UK singles chart and break into the Billboard Top 100. I do have a distinct memory of that song. I was driving around Orlando on a work trip in 1998, and this song came on the radio. And my colleague who was driving, who was also a rock guitarist in a semi-successful band of his own, just randomly started criticizing this song. And he was using it as an example to point out that it was mostly synth pads that required really no talent to play. And I didn't let him know I knew who the band was. I didn't even put up a defense because in a way I could see that he was right? I knew what he was trying to say, even if he was saying it about one of the world's most esteemed alternative bassists. Anyway, I never really got into Monaco. By the late 90s, I'd kind of had it with New Order, to be honest, and their general failure to deliver, at least since I had become a fan. I thought Republic was a huge letdown, and I was just fatigued by all the endless reissues and compilations, which were, of course, just London Records trying to recoup some cash out of this dead horse. But who could blame them? By the late 90s, I was off and running, listening to a bunch of other stuff. Monaco was just not on my dance card. Meanwhile, I should put a little title card here that says, meanwhile, we have to look in on the other two, meaning Jillian and Steven. So far, we've only focused on Barney and Hooky. Well, the other two had retreated to their farm in Macclesfield and had not so much debated what to do with their newfound free time as that they had simply defaulted to music production for television. Now, you may remember from the Technique episode, number 27, that they had dabbled in incidental music. They created the theme for the football show Best in Marsh, which showed up as a random B-side on Round and Round. And they also adapted Vanishing Point from Technique as the theme song to the TV show Making Out. Turns out the telly was interested in more of their inexpensive music, so they pretty much turned to doing that full time. In fact, they also took time to create the first theme song to America's Most Wanted, which you can still find on YouTube. And when you hear it, you'll go, of course, that's Steven and Jillian. So according to Steven, in his very readable and witty memoir, Fast Forward, he and Gillian got very good at producing bespoke music on short notice. It was a very different experience than just endlessly whittling away at a New Order record for years and years and years, and it was a new and welcome challenge. The TV folks appreciated their talent and professionalism, always delivering the goods on time. Plus, it gave Steve and Gillian a chance to spread their wings a bit artistically, outside of the confines of a band. They experimented with samples and new technology, things they normally wouldn't have done within New Order. Inevitably, however, they found themselves writing songs again, pop songs, dance pop songs. And once they wound up with a dozen or so, there was the question of what to do with them. Should we release them? Should someone sing on them? At first, neither of them wanted to sing, so they flipped through their old Rolodex, which we had back in the day, and found a contact for a friend, the English pop singer Kim Wilde. Now, for a while, Kim was on board to front this new project, but she ended up bowing out for whatever reason, leaving Gillian as the sole remaining candidate, Steven having reasoned that he was disqualified due to losing New Order's lead singer sweepstakes in 1980. So they named their project The Other Two and had recorded their first single, which they called Tasty Fish. Again, the name has nothing at all to do with the song. But Tasty Fish came out on Factory in 1991 and featured Gillian on vocals. And I gotta say, it's a banger, if you don't mind unabashed dance pop. Because that's what The Other Two is. It is polished dance music. There's not even a hint of rock on these records. It's all just groovy beats and synths. I'm not even sure if Steve played any acoustic drums. You know, who can tell? Because he does a fantastic drum machine imitation, if you haven't noticed. It's very hard to tell the difference. But damn, if you haven't heard Tasty Fish, check it out. It's a worthy song. Gillian needn't have worried. She's a fantastic singer. She suits the music perfectly. In fact, I used to play The Other Two for my kids in the car when they were little. They liked Tasty Fish because they thought the name was funny, and they also liked the music, so it was in our regular rotation. I do like this sleeve design, too. I think it's another Peter Saville joint. And sure enough, their full-length debut soon came out, The Other Two and You. It was supposed to follow shortly after the single, but ended up getting delayed due to Factory's collapse, and it would eventually come out on London Records in 1993. I probably picked this thing up in, 98 or so, a few years later. But folks, this is a great album for what it is. If you like dance music fronted by some kick-ass female vocals, this is your jam. Check it out. I'm not going to do a track by track here either, but they did have several singles off of this record. I think Selfish was the second single after Tasty Fish. These songs are well written, well performed, and it's an all-around solid record. And here's the other thing. You would never listen to this and think it was New Order. It doesn't sound like New Order at all. But listening to it, I did get a whole new appreciation for Gillian and Steven's talents. I no longer believe Hookie's claims that Gillian was useless and that Steven was too passive to influence the band in any way, because this is a solid record. And again, I'd argue there are more musical ideas here than were on that first Revenge album. Just way more. So this record came out, and London did make some fun videos for a few of the tracks. Check those out online. But then they ran into a problem. They expected Steve and Gillian to tour. See, at that point in time, at the dying end of the old music industry, the way to promote an album was to tour. Period. End of story. So that led to a conundrum, because Gillian, despite her obvious talent, had zero interest in singing live. Recording vocals in a studio? Sure, no problem. Performing live to hundreds or thousands of paying fans? No thanks, and no amount of pleading would change her mind, so Steven and the label just dropped it, and The Other Two as a project went dormant. At least until 1999, after New Order's big reunion, when The Other Two would release their follow-up album, Superhighways. which I have not yet purchased, but thinking about it, I probably should do that sometime. Because if it's more of the same, it's likely a pretty cool record. I do love the cover, by the way, obviously, another one by Peter Saville. This one was inspired not by fireworks or candies, but I'm told by diagrams of protein folding, of all things. So yeah, speaking of the New Order reunion, that did eventually happen. I guess Rob Gretton finally badgered them all enough, and they got herded into a single room again in 1998, some years after splitting up, and decided it wasn't absolutely horrible. So as I recall, they played a few warm-up gigs, most notably at the Manchester Apollo. I think that was the first one, where they were introduced as Joy Division, and proceeded to indeed play some Joy Division songs in that set. I had a recording of this gig somewhere, and I do remember they played Heart and Soul. And that was a big deal because previously they had gone to great lengths to avoid playing any Joy Division songs or even talking about Joy Division. So that was something a bit different. Another thing that would be different was that Jillian ended up leaving the band. She and Steven were now married with kids, and one of their kids had a medical condition. So Jillian ended up staying home to care for their daughter. This was the band's first lineup change since Jillian backfilled Ian Curtis in 1980. So they brought in a new guy, Phil Cunningham, who was mostly a guitarist, but who grudgingly learned Jillian's keyboard parts. This lineup would eventually produce new music in the new century, but we'll talk more about that later. Thus ended the golden age of New Order side projects. There would be one more, a ridiculous thing called Bad Lieutenant that Barney would put together after Hooky left New Order, but I don't know anything about Bad Lieutenant other than its stupid name, and it really doesn't interest me at all. Neither does New Order these days, frankly, ever since Hooky's departure. In my mind, the current lineup is indeed the longest-running New Order side project of all. It's been going on 19 years now, believe it or not. In my mind, the real New Order ceased to be in 2006, and with a few exceptions here and there, they really produced their best work prior to 1991. But that's just like my opinion, man. So there you have it, folks. The four main New Order side projects, Electronic Revenge, Monaco, and the other two, filling that 12-year gap between Technique and Get Ready, if we don't count Republic. And we don't count Republic, do we? Certainly not. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason, either on YouTube or on the podcast platform of your choice. The show that's chuffed because it fixed the vacuum cleaner. That's right. We found the right security bit to take that thing apart, fix a busted switch, and replace the roller brush to boot. So forgive us if we're walking around these days with our chest puffed out and maybe taking more time than necessary to wash the grease off our hands, inadvertently tracking filth all over the house. Who knows? We might go out into the yard later and squint into the setting sun, hands on our hips, and spit meaningfully off to one side. Maybe force the kids to go out and hear a few life lessons about how important it is to be able to fix stuff in this world. Yes, we're awfully proud of ourselves, and we're looking forward to the next thing breaking around here. 'Cause odds are some 12-year-old on YouTube will show us how to fix that too. Yep. As always, I thank you for listening, and until next time, stay strong.